So, I think by now we are all familiar with the term Quickbloom, but are we all familiar with what Quickbloom actually is? And how is it any different from Hyperbloom? Today, I'm going to fully explain how Quickbloom actually works. Quickbloom is a reaction chain involving Hydro, Dendro, and Electro to combine three reactions together: Electrocharged, Quicken, and Hyperbloom. The goal of Quickbloom teams is to have high uptime on Quicken in order for an Electro DPS to get a lot of aggravates or a Dendro DPS to get a lot of spreads, while still getting a good amount of Hyperblooms as another great source of damage. In order to understand the science behind how this works, we first need to understand how Quicken works. Quicken is the reaction between Electro and Dendro. Applying Electro onto Dendro or Dendro on Electro will trigger the Quicken reaction. When Quicken is applied, the Electro application involved to trigger it will be consumed, and Quicken will now act as a Dendro aura on the enemy. When the enemy is afflicted with the Quicken aura, applying Electro onto the enemy will now trigger Aggravate, boosting the base damage of the hit. It will also put an Electro aura onto the enemy, alongside your Quicken Dendro aura. The Electro aura coexisting alongside the Quicken aura is often referred to as underlying Electro. When Dendro is applied to an enemy afflicted with Quicken, it will trigger Spread, increasing the base damage of the hit with a higher multiplier than that of Aggravate. If there is an underlying Electro aura, the Dendro application will consume the Electro to refresh Quicken. However, if there is no underlying Electro, you will still get Spread, but you will not get Quicken. This is why Spread is not considered an Electro reaction for things like Fischl A4 and 4-piece Thundering Fury, even though Quicken is. Spread is Dendro onto Quicken, aka Dendro. It's Dendro on Dendro. Electro is not actually directly involved in Spread. Dendro auras, and thus Quicken, like any other auras, decay over time, and also when either Pyro or Hydro is applied onto the aura. In the case of Hydro, Hydro onto Dendro for Bloom is treated somewhat as a reverse reaction. Like how reverse vaporize Pyro onto Hydro, the Pyro won't fully consume the Hydro. With Bloom, Hydro onto Dendro does not fully consume the Dendro aura. 1 unit of Hydro will remove half a unit of Dendro aura. This allows Dendro to essentially function as a sponge, soaking up your Hydro application. This is great for Quickbloom, as it means your Hydro application is not immediately removing Quicken. So as long as you can refresh Quicken before the Dendro aura decays, it is possible to sustain full Quicken uptime, even with a Hydro unit on the team. However, in a lot of scenarios, the Dendro aura can still be lost. As mentioned, Dendro, like any other aura, decays over time, so it's not as if you apply 1.5 units of Dendro from Nahida and then need 3 instances of Hydro to remove it. The natural aura decay, as well as the possibility of applying Hydro multiple times before applying Dendro again, can cause you to lose Dendro aura and thus lose Quicken. But there is a very neat thing with this, and it is where Electrocharged comes in. As we know, Electrocharged is the reaction between Electro and Hydro that allows underlying Electro to exist alongside Hydro, similar to how Quicken with Dendro and Electro. Since Electrocharged is both Hydro and Electro aura, applying Dendro onto Electrocharged will result in Dendro reacting with both elements. It will react with Electro to trigger Quicken, and it will also react with Hydro to create Bloom. This is excellent for 2 reasons. Firstly, it means that you will be able to get Dendro as the aura onto the enemy again with just 1 instance of Dendro application. If you had Hydro on the enemy without the underlying Electro, the Dendro would consume the Hydro, but you would then have no aura left after, and need a second instance of Dendro to actually get a Dendro aura applied. And then after that, you would still need another instance of Electro application to get Quicken. So Electrocharge lets you both regain Dendro as an aura with 1 application of Dendro instead of 2, and it allows you to regain Quicken without needing to apply Electro, since you already had the underlying Electro for Quicken to consume instead. The second great thing about Electrocharged here is, anytime you apply Dendro onto Electrocharged, you are essentially getting 2 blooms from that one instance of Dendro application. This is because you first trigger Bloom from the Dendro application applied onto Electrocharged, then your next instance of Hydro application is going to apply Hydro onto Dendro, triggering yet another Bloom. Whereas otherwise, if you are only applying Hydro onto Dendro and never Dendro onto EC, your Bloom counts are bottlenecked by the amount of times you apply Hydro. This results in Quicken teams with slower Hydro application, generally having higher Quicken uptime but lower Hyperbloom counts, whereas a team with faster Hydro application may have more Hyperblooms but less Quicken uptime. However, it is also not quite that straightforward. Something very important to know is that losing Quicken uptime does not automatically equate to losing Aggravates. As long as you have that underlying Electro from Electrocharged, your next instance of Dendro application will trigger Quicken. Thus, Aggravate counts are not directly tied to Quicken uptime. If you applied Electro during the time that Quicken was not applied, then that is a lost Aggravate. But because Electro units have ICD and don't apply Electro on every hit, very often most, if not all of the hits that you got in while Quicken was not applied, were not applying Electro anyway, meaning that little to no Aggravates were actually lost. Now, while Aggravate counts are not directly tied to Quicken uptime, the same does not apply to spread. If you lose Quicken Aura, you are guaranteed to lose at least one spread every time. This is because, while you have an underlying Electro with Electrocharged, there is no such underlying Dendro. Therefore, the only way to get Quicken back is to apply Dendro. And the Dendro application that triggers the initial Quicken does not also get spread, thus you lost a spread in order to regain Quicken. This will happen every single time you lose Quicken. For spread, this also makes it important to have reasonably frequent Electro application. If your Electro application is too slow, you may not get Electrocharged when you apply Dendro onto Hydro, so Quicken would not actually be refreshed, and instead you just got Bloom. You would then need both another instance of Dendro application, aka another lost spread, and also another Electro application to regain Quicken in this scenario, resulting in a ton of spreads being lost. Okay, now that we understand how Quickbloom works in theory, let's take a look how it plays out in some actual teams. A Cyno Quickbloom team generally plays with a team core of Cyno, Nahida, Baizu, and either Furina, Yelan, or Xingqiu as the Hydro. If using Xingqiu, he applies Hydro extremely fast, especially at C6, so you will lose the Quicken Aura pretty frequently, thus have Electrocharged as the Aura pretty often. This makes it super important to have 2 Dendro units on the team. You want to reapply Quicken as soon as possible, to lose as little Aggravates as possible, but on top of that, as explained earlier, applying Dendro onto Electrocharged, you are going to get 2 blooms, one from the Dendro application and another from your next instance of Hydro application. Xingqiu's Hydro application is fast enough to do this every single time, so you get far more Hyperblooms with him as the Hydro compared to Furina or Yelan. But you really need 2 Dendro appliers in order to take advantage of this, because since the Hyperbloom counts are this high due to Dendro on EC, you really want to apply Dendro again before your next Hydro application if possible, otherwise the next Hydro application was essentially wasted and didn't actually get any blooms. So without 2 Dendro units on the team, you will lose a ton of Aggravates while not actually getting much more Hyperblooms when using Xingqiu. But if you are using double Dendro, over a 3 NC rotation, you'll get on average about 11 Aggravates and 22 to 24 Hyperblooms. So with a C0 Cyno, in this team, Hyperbloom is about 60% of his damage. If using Yelan, assuming she is C0, while her Hydro application is by no means slow, compared to Xingqiu, it is much slower. The slower Hydro application will result in getting Electrocharged about half as often as with Xingqiu, so the Hyperbloom counts take a hit, but in exchange, you lose less Aggravates. In double Dendro, on average, this comes out to about 16 Hyperblooms and 14 Aggravates, with Hyperbloom being about 47% of Cyno's total damage. One important distinction with Yelan here instead of Xingqiu is, since Yelan's Hydro application is slower than Xingqiu's, you can use just one Dendro unit and still get a pretty similar reaction count to if you were using two. If using Farina as the Hydro unit, while her Hydro application is more spaced out than Yelan's, over a full 3 INSEE rotation, she ends up applying Hydro about the same amount of times, resulting in, on average, the same amount of Hyperblooms. However, because of how much more spaced out her Hydro application is than Yelan's, Quicken is refreshed between each Hydro application much more consistently, resulting in more Aggravates. Over a 3 INSEE rotation with Farina and double Dendro, you can expect Sino 2 on average get about 18 Aggravates and 13 Hyperblooms. Like with Yelan, you can also get fairly similar reaction counts even with only one Dendro unit, but the Dendro unit does need to be Nahida for this. Farina can sometimes apply Hydro twice in the same second, so Nahida's 1.5U Dendro application would help soak that up. Compared to any other Dendro unit with 1U application, you would sometimes lose Quicken Aura a lot more frequently with just one Dendro. Now, if you're using a Dendro DPS in Quickbloom instead of Electro, things are a bit different. In an Alhaitham Quickbloom team, the team car has to be Alhaitham, a second Dendro unit, an Electro Hyperbloom trigger, and your Hydro applier. The biggest difference between how Quickbloom with a Dendro DPS works compared to Electro is, as explained earlier, while Aggravate counts are not directly tied to Quicken uptime, spread counts are. If you lose Quicken, you lose spreads. This makes having that second Dendro unit extremely important, so that they can sometimes be the one to refresh Quicken and lose a spread instead of Alhaitham. Spread counts being directly tied to Quicken uptime also makes it important to use a slower yet frequent source of Hydro application, such as Yelan, as opposed to a faster source like Xingqiu, since the faster Hydro application will result in losing Quicken several times, therefore losing quite a high amount of spreads. And that's about all you need to understand with Quickbloom. As you can see, there are very important differences between how Quickbloom teams function compared to pure Hyperbloom teams. Quickbloom takes advantage of the reaction chains between Dendro, Electro, and Hydro to get high damage from Aggravate and or spread, while still having Hyperbloom as a great source of damage as well. Hyperbloom teams focus on maximizing the amount of Hyperblooms they get as much as possible, without care for Aggravate and spread damage. So if you learned anything from today's video, or if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and please also let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks. Bye.